Hey everybody, it's Dr. Aline Potvin. I am here again for another installment of Wellness Ed Sunday. And happy Super Bowl Sunday for all of you that are enjoying it. Hopefully you'll be able to catch this later. So this week, well, first of all, in practice, I see a large amount of people with autoimmune diseases. And, there's between 80 and 100 different kinds of autoimmune disease. But the foundation of every autoimmune disease is that the body's immune system is essentially confused and starts to attack self-tissue. And so in many cases, you end up with conditions that are very definitely damaging and life-threatening, but certainly destructive to the tissues. And they tend to, looks like we have a friend with us today. Certainly can greatly decrease quality of life. And, there's not a ton of treatment options from a conventional perspective for autoimmune disease. So, people that have things like rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, Sjogren's disease, Hashimoto's, psoriasis, inflammatory bowel disease, a lot of times they end up coming to see me because, they may have seen good control of some of the inflammation that they experience with the medications that they use, but their quality of life still is kind of crummy. They're tired all the time. They're probably still in a fair bit of pain. I see a lot of people with Hashimoto's, and a lot of them don't even realize that it's actually an autoimmune disease. They've been told that they have a hypothyroid condition, which is true, but the root cause or the cause of their type of hypothyroidism is actually an autoimmune disease. So oftentimes people are put on medications. In this case, in the case of Hashimoto's, they're put on thyroid hormone, but the autoimmune aspect of their disease is actually never addressed. And so, a large percentage of my practice population has some form of autoimmune condition. And so I've seen over time some of the things that can be major triggers for people in terms of kicking off flares and increasing the likelihood that they're going to have a flare. And for some people, this can be incredibly debilitating. It can keep them from work. It can keep them from being able to get about and do their daily tasks. It can make them incredibly depressed or anxious. And so if we know what some of the triggers for a flare are, the idea is that, with a naturopathic approach, we would be able to reduce their likelihood of getting a flare, going into a flare altogether, and helping them, guide them into remission. So I really try to emphasize with people some of the different kinds of scenarios that can increase their risk of flare as a way to help them enjoy better quality of life and step into remission with their autoimmune disease. So one of the biggest things that I see for people is that most people have some sort of trigger food, or food that if they eat it in regularity or regular succession, they tend to increase their risk of having a flare. Now, we know that autoimmune disease, the root cause of autoimmune, essentially all autoimmune disease, starts with disruption to the gut, to the inside of the gut lining. And so when there's weakness there, that's when we can see this uprising of autoimmune disease. It's one of the many causes that can lead to autoimmune disease in general. But for each person, I've noticed, there tends to be foods that can be really specifically flare-inducing for them. And for many people, it's similar ones. Generally speaking, I tell people to stay away from, wheat products, anything with gluten in it when they have an autoimmune disease. Corn is another one, which is really tricky because, as I'm sure most of you have realized, corn is essentially in every processed product or packaged product. And so it can be really hard to avoid some of these foods. But in my experience, they tend to be really, they greatly increase the likelihood of a flare. So gluten, corn being two big ones. For some people, and this, the evidence suggests that there may be a genetic component here, but some people actually tend to be quite sensitive to the lectin content of their diet. Lectins being proteins that are present in a lot of legumes, grains, and so I've actually seen with some of my patients that are vegan, vegetarian, that actually moving them into a non-vegan or more omnivorous diet actually has helped them be able to reduce their flare frequency. And this isn't, again, necessarily the case for everyone, but from what I've read in the past and what I've seen, there tends to be a genetic component to that. So looking at lectin content of food, looking at wheat, gluten products, and also corn products tend to be really big triggers for people. Now, some people also are more sensitive to the nightshade family. So that would include a lot of tasty things like tomatoes, potatoes, eggplants, peppers, all of that delicious, salsa making food. I tend to see it being a greater issue with things like rheumatoid arthritis, but again, autoimmune diseases have this kind of common, elements of common root cause, and so others can be affected too, even if they have a different type of autoimmune disease. But those food groups tend to be a bigger issue for people. So that's gluten, any corn-derived product, foods that tend to be high in lectin content like grains and pulses and beans, legumes, and also the nightshades can be an issue for people. So really exploring a person's, how frequently they're eating some of these foods, and actually tracking where their flares are in relationship to their diet is something I sometimes have people to do because it can really be quite enlightening in terms of relationship to their flare and flare frequency. So food sensitivity is a big one that I have people check because it tends to really contribute. I think a lot of times people really take for granted how much their emotional state and their management of stress impacts, not just autoimmune disease, but really any chronic health issue or chronic symptom. And one of the biggest contributors, from what I've seen in practice, to autoimmune flares is generalized stress and high stress situations. There's even some thought, if you look back at, some of the exploration they did of this in the early 2000s, there's even some thought that very stressful situations actually can induce the beginning of an autoimmune disease in general. And there's a lot of, they've done a lot of studying of that connection. And, it makes sense because when we're under any amount of stress, acute, chronic, it greatly changes our chemistry in terms of hormone release, hormone interacting with one another, and, eventually that hormone imbalance, namely cortisol being our long-term stress hormone, will greatly influence how our immune system functions. And this makes sense, right? If we were, in caveman times, we certainly, going through some sort of famine or lack of food, would likely have an effect on our immune system. More often than not, a suppression of our immune system, because it's not, while it is an essential protectant for us. It also is not quite as essential as keeping your heart beating, etc., and keeping your brain alive. So your body will not necessarily prioritize proper and fully functional immune status when you have stress. I'm sure all of you have probably experienced that, even if you don't have an autoimmune disease. But there's a very, very great correlation between autoimmune flares, immune dysregulation in general, and a stress response. And from what I see with my patients, it's a long-term stress response that tends to have the greatest impact. And it's really, it's really quite common. I'll have, because I also work with mostly women in my practice, I'll have, people come in that may be in the middle of a rheumatoid arthritis flare, for example. They happen to be in, the height of stress at work, and they can't get comfortable. Their body just cannot settle. It truly is, a physical manifestation of that stress response. And in addition to that, when cortisol is heightened, what cortisol will also do is increase our perception of pain. So pain that maybe would not be, or discomfort that maybe wouldn't be as extreme when a person wasn't in a stress state, is greatly magnified when they're in a stress state. So that makes sense as well, because if you're already in danger, if your body already perceives it's in danger, it doesn't want to be in any further danger. So it's going to react even in an even larger capacity to any additional stress. So stress is a huge contributor to flare frequency in people with autoimmune diseases. And this is, in autoimmune diseases that don't necessarily have, things like joint destruction as part of it, like you'd see in rheumatoid arthritis. I oftentimes see people's thyroid numbers, in a Hashimoto's case, really go up and down when they're stressed. And we notice, if we kind of track back over time, what we see is that, some of their most stressful periods in their life have been, greatly connected to what's been going on with their thyroid. So, very, very big impact there. The third type of influence that I see a lot in practice is also infections of any kind. I do notice if people have a viral infection, or catch, or have some sort of bacterial infection, there is, they do tend to be at greater risk for actually, sliding into an autoimmune flare. And it makes sense. Their immune system is kind of juggling a few different things at once. It already has this tendency to be confused. And so I do see that people tend to have a greater likelihood of an autoimmune flare if they're also sick with something else. That also is another trigger that we've identified as being possible kickoff for the beginning and the development of autoimmune disease as well. So it's certainly all the more reason to really pay attention to stress, diet, sleep, all these things that will keep your immune system functioning well in general and help you hold off, the colds and flus that are out there. Now that becomes a little bit more difficult when people tend to be on medications that, immunosuppress in general. Sometimes they make them more susceptible to getting sick, or their body not necessarily being able to fight off pathogen. So in general, people with autoimmune disease should be, very cautious and conscious of, what their exposure levels are. So 3 main things that I've identified for all of you tonight that can greatly contribute to autoimmune flares are food sensitivities and diet, and certain elements of the diet. Stress being, I would say, the number one, and also the one that we don't make the connection with often, if you think about, just how your body will respond to stress in general, the tight neck, perhaps tension in the gut, headaches, things like that. Those are oftentimes things that people will experience with autoimmune diseases as well. And stress only heightens that physiological response. Okay? So food, stress, and, being mindful of, not dividing what the job that your immune system has to do, making sure that you are able to keep colds and flus away, in addition to other, infectious diseases. So those are some of the big things I see as being flare-inducing in practice. And what I can recommend is really trying to, over time, be aware. I even recommend people track their flares. Keep a journal. Since most of the people that I see are women in practice, a lot of them are actually using things like Woman Log, etc., to track, their cycles and other parameters. And I recommend that they actually log their flares on their calendar as well. And as they're keeping track of, mood, notes for the day, they keep track of their diet and exercise, keep track of their hormones over time, you can actually start to see patterns as well and what is happening in relationship to the flares that they experience. And so if I can recommend one thing for all of you to try, if autoimmunity is something that you kind of struggle with, is really starting to pay attention to those patterns and see what is it that's a trigger for you. It might be a few things, but once you know what your patterns are, then you can actually do something about it. So I'm going to let you guys go for today. Enjoy the Super Bowl for all of you that are watching, and I will see you all again next week, and I hope you enjoy this week as well. Take care.